The slap landed before the boy could explain himself, loud and brutal across his cheek, sending him stumbling into the dust with nothing but a muffled cry stuck behind clenched teeth, and the man in the designer glasses stepped over him like filth, eyes flaring at the faint handprint the child's dusty fingers had left on the gleaming mirror of his imported SUV. The boy had only wanted to see his reflection. He'd never seen himself in something that shiny before, and the car had caught the light like a treasure from a dream. But to Chief Ayodeji, that smudge was an offense, a stain on a status he wore like second skin. His guards chuckled nervously as the boy tried to crawl away, one hand pressed against his face, the other clutching the small bag of mangoes he had spent the entire morning hawking. And Ayodeji, without another glance, barked for someone to wash the car again and drove off as if the moment had no weight, as if the boy was nothing but a nuisance from a world beneath him. But the market froze in disbelief, and a woman near the tomato stall whispered, "That boy is someone's future," not knowing just how close to home that truth would soon cut. The boy did not return home that night, and the woman who waited for him sat on a wooden stool under a flickering bulb, wringing the hem of her wrapper with fingers that had grown used to holding grief like a second child. And when her neighbor finally arrived with the story that her son had been beaten in public by a powerful man for nothing but touching a car, her knees gave out before her breath did. She had told Kelechi not to wander far, not to stay late, and especially not to linger near the luxury cars parked at the new development site, where the rich now came to inspect their towers of glass. And yet he had gone anyway, drawn like all children by light and movement and wonder, unaware of the fire that burns those born without protection. She didn't cry as she packed her slippers and hurried into the night, searching for him among the gutters and alleys, through market shadows and concrete silence, until at last she found him curled behind a shuttered shop, cheeks swollen, shirt torn, mangoes scattered like broken teeth. And when she lifted him into her arms, he didn't speak. He simply clung to her like a memory begging not to be forgotten. The next morning, Ayodeji sat across from his wife, at their glass breakfast table, scrolling through the latest news headlines without noticing the tension in her shoulders or the way her spoon trembled slightly before it reached her mouth. And when she asked casually if he had any problems at the new construction site yesterday, he barely looked up, just muttered something about a stubborn street boy messing with the Lexus, then went back to his phone, not catching the way her breath hitched or how her hand dropped the spoon without sound. He didn't see her eyes widen or her face go pale, because Ayodeji never looked long at people unless they could benefit his empire. And the woman sitting across from him had learned long ago how to keep secrets hidden behind carefully arranged smiles. But now one of those secrets had been struck open in a public market, bruised by the very hands she had chosen to trust when she married into power. She excused herself with a soft voice and locked the bathroom door behind her, gripping the edge of the sink as her reflection blurred, because she knew the boy he spoke of, had known since the moment she heard his story on the neighborhood group chat before breakfast, and the storm inside her had only just begun to rise. She left the house that afternoon in silence, not telling the driver where to go until they were already deep in the market district, past the glass front shops and gated compounds, into the streets where memory still lived, because years ago, before she wore gold on her fingers and satin, on her skin, she had worn pain like a scarf and raised a child in secret, a child born from a mistake she was never allowed to name. She had been young, afraid, and alone, and when her family sent her away to have the baby quietly, she had given birth to Kelechi in a small clinic run by nuns who promised discretion, and afterward, believing she had no choice, she left him, in the care of the woman who had once been her nanny, paying monthly from a hidden account while building a new identity with Ayodeji, who knew nothing of her past. She had planned to reunite with her son slowly, once the time was right, once the risks were low. But now that plan had shattered under the force of her husband's rage. And as she stood at the door of the small house where her son now lay, recovering, she realized there were truths that refused to stay buried, and some wounds, once reopened, refused to close quietly. She sat beside her son's bed in the small, dim room, her eyes locked on his swollen cheek, her heart breaking in slow motion as she reached out and gently brushed his hair back, wondering how she had ever believed she could keep this part of her life hidden from the man she now shared a mansion with. Kelechi didn't know her as mother, only as the kind woman who came every few weeks with food, school supplies, and envelopes sealed with love she never dared to say aloud. And now here she was, faced with the bleeding truth she had tried to avoid, that her silence had cost him protection, that her shame had opened the door for violence to walk in dressed as power. She didn't speak much that day, just held his hand, studied the bruises, and listened as he told her in broken whispers what happened. How the man yelled, how the guards laughed, how he thought he might never get back up. And when he finally fell asleep, she stepped outside the house and wept quietly beneath the hibiscus bush, her tears not for what had been done but for how much longer she had allowed it to remain undone. Because now that the truth had touched skin and drawn blood, it would never go back into hiding again. Back at the mansion, Ayodeji poured himself whiskey and leaned back in his office chair, his mind preoccupied with contracts and deadlines, unaware that his carefully constructed life was beginning to crack from the inside. His secretary had just informed him that the governor's office was backing out of a property deal, citing social sensitivity concerns, and though he barked at her to find out more, he suspected it had to do with the viral clip circulating. Grainy footage of a wealthy man striking a poor child by a car, uploaded anonymously but already gathering fury online. He didn't think much of it at first. Scandals came and went. But the weight of this one felt different, like a thread being pulled from a web too tightly spun. His phone buzzed with messages from PR consultants, warning him to stay quiet, let it pass. But Ayodeji wasn't one to bow to pressure, especially not from the noise of the poor, as he once called it. Yet beneath his arrogance, a seed of discomfort was beginning to grow, and the more he ignored it, the more it tightened around his chest, like an invisible rope slowly drawing him toward something he couldn't yet name. The nanny had aged since those early years, but her eyes were as sharp as ever, and when the woman she once raised stood at her doorstep again, this time not to drop off supplies but to stay, she immediately knew something had gone terribly wrong. They spoke in low tones inside the small living room, and when she learned what had happened, she didn't rage or cry, only nodded with the quiet authority of someone who had seen too much in her lifetime to be surprised. "Truth waits for no one," she finally said, pouring warm water into a basin for the boy's bath, her hands moving with the same grace they had used to raise both mother and son. As she wiped Kalechi's face gently and sang an old lullaby under her breath, the woman watched in silence, the weight of years pressing down on her shoulders, years of pretending, of reshaping her past for approval, of swallowing motherhood behind a mask of status, and now that mask had cracked, revealing not disgrace, but the raw need to reclaim what was always hers. She knew she had delayed this reunion far too long, and with every glance toward the boy who had her eyes, she also knew the time for hiding was gone forever. That evening, the house staff at the mansion noticed something different. Madam had returned, but she didn't greet anyone, didn't change into her usual evening caftan, didn't enter the dining room where Ayodeji waited with plates steaming and lips full of excuses. Instead, she went directly to the bedroom, locked the door behind her, and stood at the window staring out into the night, her fingers clenched around a photograph she had taken from the nanny's house, a picture of Kalechi at age 4, smiling, shyly beside a cake she had sent but never cut with him. She had stared at the photo the whole ride home, not with guilt anymore, but with resolve. And now, as the moon rose higher and the city buzzed beneath her, she made a silent vow that this story would not end with shame, or violence, or hidden truths in gold-plated closets. It would end with names being spoken, with hearts being claimed, with one man forced to face the boy whose tears had once washed his polished car. Ayodeji paced the length of his study with restlessness that didn't come from deadlines or board meetings, but from a silence too loud to ignore. His wife hadn't spoken to him in 2 days, and the chill in the house was no longer from the central air conditioning. She moved through the mansion like a ghost, avoiding eye contact, locking doors behind her, answering questions with nods or nothing at all. And for the first time in their marriage, he felt something he didn't know how to name. Unease born, not from guilt, but from fear of what he didn't understand. When he finally confronted her in the corridor near the staircase, asking what was wrong, she turned to him slowly, held out a small photograph, and said with a voice so calm it cut through bone, "That boy you beat is mine." Ayodeji stood frozen, his eyes scanning the photo. The face of the child he had slapped now seared into his memory with horrifying clarity, and the weight of those words collapsed onto his chest like bricks. Not because he had, beaten a stranger's child, but because he had unknowingly raised his hand against the very bloodline he had sworn to protect. And in that moment, all the pride, all the luxury, all the noise that had once made him feel powerful dissolved, leaving behind a man staring into the abyss of his own reflection. She didn't wait for his reaction. She simply turned and walked away, each step echoing with decades of silence she had swallowed so he could shine freely. And now that the truth stood between them like a cracked mirror, she had no more energy left to fix what had already shattered. Ayodeji staggered back into the study and sank into his chair, staring at the photograph like it might reach out and slap him in return, and his thoughts raced through years of curated perfection, of appearances guarded with military precision, only to realize that the past he thought he had married into had been edited, cleaned, and redrawn for his comfort. He felt betrayed. Yes, but deeper than that, he felt small. Like the luxury that defined him had suddenly turned against him, exposing his ignorance in the cruelest way possible. He remembered the boy's flinch, the fear, the tears. Not just of pain, but of confusion. And he wondered now what kind of man delivered punishment without even asking for a name. Shame crept in, not like a flood, but like a slow poison. And as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting the mansion into a shadow that felt more fitting than ever, Ayodeji realized something far worse than guilt. He had lost the right to call himself a father. And worse, he had earned it in reverse. The next morning, Ayodeji dressed in plain clothes and drove himself, no driver, no escort, no tinted windows, into the district he once looked down on from conference towers, and he parked at the corner near the old market, the very place where he had raised his hand in arrogance and bruised a child in front of the world. As he stepped out of the car, people stared, some in recognition, others in contempt. But no one greeted him, and it felt like the world had drawn a line he wasn't allowed to cross anymore. He asked around quietly, following vague directions until he arrived at the narrow street where the nanny's house stood, and he hesitated at the gate, unsure of what to say, unsure if he would even be allowed to knock. But the door opened. Before he could lift his hand, and there stood the nanny, her eyes sharp with knowing, her body still holding the weight of years as she stepped aside wordlessly and let him in. Inside, he found the boy seated on the floor, folding paper into the shape of a boat, his cheek still marked, but his spirit quiet. And when their eyes met, there was no hate, just distance, as though the boy already understood that grown-ups often broke what they should have protected. And Ayodeji, speechless, kneeled down, not to speak, but to listen for the first time in his life. They sat in silence for a long time, the man and the boy, separated by blood, time, and a single moment that had rewritten everything. And eventually, Ayodeji reached into his coat and placed a toy car on the floor between them. Not expensive, not symbolic, just plastic and real, like a peace offering without ceremony. The boy looked at it, touched it gently, then pushed it back toward him, without anger. And that gesture broke something inside Ayodeji deeper than shouting ever could. The nanny finally spoke, her voice slow and deliberate, telling him stories of the boy's resilience, how he loved counting buses, how he once asked why cars were only shiny when poor people touched them with fear, and how every time he smiled, it reminded her of the girl she once raised who now lived in a house too big to remember who she used to be. Ayodeji didn't respond. He couldn't, because some words burn better in silence, and when he left that evening, he didn't take the car with him, nor did he leave a promise, because he knew now that redemption could not be declared, only earned, and it would take more than gifts or money to build a bridge back to the child he never knew he had already failed. The following day, the housekeeper noticed the difference in the house before anyone said a word. The silence had changed shape, not tense anymore but heavy, as if grief itself had moved in and started pacing the halls. Madame no longer wore. Her jewelry no longer corrected the maids, no longer smiled for the camera during charity events. And Chief Ayodeji, once loud with control, now sat in the garden long past sunset, his eyes sunken, his phone untouched, his mind looping the same scene. Not the slap, but the look on his wife's face when she said, "He's your son too." No statement had been made to the press, no denial, no apology, but the streets remembered, and so did the internet, where hashtags still carried the sting of his name, and the mansion that once rang with cocktail music now echoed with unanswered questions, especially from the staff who had served them for years without knowing a child lived outside, carrying the bloodline alone. Something had fractured beneath the chandeliers and marbled floors, and the staff whispered quietly. Not out of gossip, but out of mourning, because they too had believed they knew the family they worked for. And now that illusion lay cracked. At their feet, like an expensive dish no one wanted to admit had fallen. In the days that followed, Ayodeji returned to the boys' street 3 times, not to visit, but to watch from a distance, parked across the road like a man chasing his own ghost. And each time he saw Kelechi walking home from school, backpack swinging, dust on his shoes, a slight limp still present in his stride. And each time, Ayodeji remained in the car, hands gripping the steering wheel, mouth dry, courage dissolving just as the boy disappeared behind the gate. He wasn't sure what he feared more, the boy rejecting him or worse, forgiving him too easily, like he didn't deserve to be remembered as the man who bruised a child for daring to reach out with wonder. He spent those evenings staring at himself in mirrors, no longer checking his tie or cufflinks but his eyes, trying to find the boy he used to be before money turned him into a judge of everything beneath him. One night, he walked back into the bedroom and found his wife reading a worn paperback he hadn't seen in years, a book she used to read aloud to underprivileged children before their marriage, before her story had been pruned and retold for the media. And when she looked up at him, she didn't speak. But he saw in her gaze a line had been drawn: rebuild, or leave everything behind. A week later, invitations were printed in simple brown envelopes. No gold edges. No embossed logos, no titles, just a date, a time, and a location. A small community hall in the very district where it all began. People were confused. Why would Chief Ayodeji host anything there? But curiosity brought them in anyway. The market women, the roadside vendors, the security guards who had seen him from a distance and thought he breathed a different kind of air. They filled the plastic chairs with skepticism, waiting for the trick, the speech, the excuse. And then the doors opened, and he walked in. No suit, no glasses, no entourage, holding his son's hand. Kelechi walked beside him slowly, face shy but firm, and gasps rippled through the hall as recognition struck like lightning. Ayodeji stepped up to the small podium with no paper in his hand, only a voice that cracked as he began, not with apology, but with confession. He told the whole story: the slap, the ignorance, the discovery, the silence, and the shame. He didn't ask for applause, didn't wrap it in poetry. He simply laid himself bare before the very people he once looked down on. And when he stepped down from the stage, it was the boy who took his hand first, gripping it without hesitation. And in that moment the applause came, not loud but long, and in every clap was the sound of a wall being broken down. The photo went viral by evening, not the one taken by paparazzi or curated by a PR team, but one snapped by a schoolgirl sitting in the crowd, showing a man kneeling on one knee while tying the shoe of a boy who held his head high, smiling with quiet confidence. It spread not because of the man's fame, but because of the caption the girl added underneath. Power isn't in how hard you slap, it's in how gently you fix what you've broken. People shared it not out of sympathy, but because they recognized something rare, not just repentance but transformation. Ayodeji's reputation didn't suddenly recover, but it no longer mattered. He had found something heavier than his empire, a name that was no longer just whispered in shame, but spoken in full by a child who now sat at the center of his world. At home, his wife framed the photo and placed it on the mantel next to their wedding portrait, not as a symbol of repair, but as a reminder of truth. Because sometimes families are not built by secrets, but by the brave reckoning of what's been hidden too long. After the public reconciliation, life did not magically align itself, and Ayodeji quickly learned that forgiveness was not an event. It was a journey stitched with patience and humility. The boy did not move into the mansion immediately. Nor did he start calling him Dad, and his wife remained protective, ensuring that every step toward rebuilding was earned with presence, not promises. Ayodeji visited often, always bringing books instead of toys, and sat with the boy while he did his homework on a plastic stool in the narrow hallway of the nanny's house. They would speak only a little, but the boy's trust returned in pieces. A smile here, a question there, a moment of laughter that came unexpectedly one afternoon, when Ayodeji failed to peel an orange properly and splashed juice into his own eye. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real, and that was more than Ayodeji had known how to hope for. The community watched in cautious admiration, unsure how long this change would last. But they saw the consistency, how the man once feared and hated returned again and again, not to take, not to boast, but to be present, quiet, learning, rebuilding a bond from the ground up without ever asking for credit. The media buzz died down slowly, replaced by other scandals, other headlines. But the photograph of Ayodeji and his son lingered in public memory like a watermark on conscience. And though the business world eventually moved on, it was the staff at his company who noticed the shift first. He now greeted by name, listened, before interrupting, even dismissed a manager who mocked a cleaner's accent during a staff meeting. His board, once filled with only wealthy shareholders, now included a woman from his wife's old orphanage who specialized in community development. And his company began sponsoring scholarship programs without press releases, without cameras. Yet the biggest change wasn't corporate, it was personal. He no longer obsessed over status, no longer needed to dominate every room. Instead, his joy came from watching his son win a spelling competition at school, from being asked to attend a school father-son picnic he had never imagined being invited to, and from hearing Kelechi say quietly one evening while watching a football match, "You're not bad at this dad thing anymore." It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was the kind of sentence that rewrote every bruise in memory, a seed of healing finally taking root. The mansion changed too, not its walls or tiles, but its spirit, where once it echoed with silence and cold decorum. Now it hummed with conversation, with meals taken together, with laughter from a boy who once flinched at luxury, but now challenged his stepfather to video game duels in the living room. One day, Kelechi asked his mother why she had never told Ayodeji about him sooner, and she answered with a weight in her voice that only truth carries. "Because I didn't know if he would love both of us." The boy nodded, not with judgment, but with the maturity only children born of hardship ever fully hold, and said, "He does now," before going back to building a house from toy blocks on the floor. And in that moment, the woman who had once hidden her son out of fear felt a corner of her soul exhale, not in relief, but in release. Because everything she had buried, every wound she had wrapped in silence, had now bloomed into the very thing she feared she would never have, a home made not of wealth or forgiveness, but of accountability and love reborn in daylight. That weekend, the boy brought home an art project from school, a drawing of a man, a woman, and a child standing beside a red car. The figures were smiling. The sun had a face, and beneath it was written in shaky block letters, "My family." Ayodeji stared at the drawing for a long time before pinning it to his study wall, right next to his awards and certificates. And when his wife asked why he placed it there, he simply said, "Because this is the only thing here I actually earned." It was the first time she had seen him cry. Not in regret, not in shame, but in gratitude for the strange and painful road that had brought him from arrogance to fatherhood. And later that night, when the boy asked if they could all go for a drive the next day, he smiled and tossed him the car keys, saying, "Only if you drive us." And the boy laughed, not because he could, but because he knew he finally belonged inside that car, not outside it looking in. The sun rose quietly that morning, draping soft gold across the city's rooftops, and in a modest church tucked between aging government flats, Ayodeji stood before a small crowd with his wife beside him and Kelechi between them, dressed in white, smiling without effort, and holding a certificate of dedication with his name freshly printed across it. Not a legal adoption document, not a PR stunt, just a public declaration that the boy he once hurt was now the boy he claimed completely. The pastor's words were simple, spoken without flourish, but they landed like a thunderclap in Ayodeji's chest. To raise a child is to be raised by them also. The guests clapped, some teared up. But it was Kelechi who looked up at the man beside him and whispered, "This time I'm really yours, right?" And Ayodeji, blinking back tears that no business deal had ever pulled from him, nodded with a voice that cracked, saying only, "Always." There were no reporters, no camera flashes, but the moment was etched in more hearts than any magazine cover. Because in that little church, status sat down and family stood up, side by side, equal in truth, and bonded not by perfection, but by pain, made whole. Months later, a new development was launched under Ayodeji's company name. Not another glass tower or gated estate, but a community library built in the same district where the slap had first landed. Its walls were covered in murals painted by schoolchildren, and above the entrance in bold colors were the words, "Curiosity should be encouraged, not punished." During the opening ceremony, Kelechi stood with a microphone, not as a victim, but as the honorary guest, and told the story, not of a rich man and a poor boy, but of a mistake, a truth, and a new beginning. The audience, filled with market, women, teachers, construction workers, and children, listened not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. And when the boy finished, his father stood to the side, clapping quietly, his pride not loud but deep, knowing that he would never erase the past, but he had finally built something worthy of it, something that could outlive the shame and teach others how not to repeat it. One evening, long after the library had opened and life had found a quieter rhythm, Kelechi sat beside Ayodeji in the garden, both staring at the sky in silence. The boy asked if he remembered the day of the slap, and Ayodeji's face stiffened, unsure how to respond. But the boy continued, "I used to wish I never saw that car. Now I'm glad I did." And Ayodeji turned to him, stunned, as the boy shrugged and added, "It brought me home." No speech could follow that. No apology could match its grace. Just silence between them. A silence that was no longer filled with discomfort, but with understanding. And in that silence, a wound closed fully. Ayodeji placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and said nothing, knowing at last that fatherhood wasn't something claimed by blood or marriage. It was proven through repentance, through rebuilding, through standing in the place where your mistake once broke someone and choosing to stay. Years from now, when Kelechi would be grown and telling his own story to rooms filled with children or strangers, or maybe even his own son, he would not begin with a slap or a car or a mansion. He would begin with a moment in the street where power failed, and then with a moment in a hallway where truth was finally told. He would speak of the man who hurt him. Yes, but more about the man who healed alongside him, and how sometimes the people we fear the most are the ones waiting to transform, if only they are forced to look into the mirror of what they've done. And when they ask him how he forgave, he'd say simply, "Because he stayed." And in those words, buried deep within the soft hum of a story passed on, would live the truth that stunned a nation. That sometimes it takes one act of cruelty to uncover a hidden son, and one quiet act of love to raise a broken man into a father. We hope you enjoyed today's story. Give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. That's all for today. We see you in the next story. Till then, take care, folks.